Good morning. So, in our last session, we were talking about the different stage theories, and we're going to start with Piaget's stage theory. And Piaget's is a little bit different in development, where the other two we've talked about were psychosexual and psychosocial development. So, I find that teachers may really be more familiar with Piaget's theory than the ones that we've discussed so far. And I suspect that most of you have learned about Piaget in your undergraduate work. But since that's been a while for some of us, I just want to talk about it for just a few minutes. Um, and then, of course, we'll talk about it more in other chapters. But Piaget did most of his early studies with his own three children in his own home. But even with such a small sample, he was a leader in his time. Um, Even today, the real only criticisms that we hear about his work usually focus on the time periods that things happen rather than the sequence that they happen in, if that makes sense. So, um, Piaget's ideas about cognitive development weren't translated into English until the 1960s. Um, Scientists were very excited about this new theory, and his theory provided an explanation, and this is important, so let me say it again so that you will remember it. Piaget's theory provided an explanation for the complex quantitative stages, really qualitative even more than quantitative. And there are some fundamental similarities, or your books call them continuity, from stage to stage in Piaget's theory that explain how children develop cognitive process depends upon a child's active engagement with the world. So if you put them in a box and never allowed them to engage in any kind of activities or be around any other people, then they would not develop appropriately according to Piaget. Um, we'll talk more about active engagement when we talk about early childhood because that's a very important component of early childhood development. But for now, I just really want you to know that Piaget believed that this active process allows children to self organize their information. And so, by that, when we talk about early childhood, we'll talk about how they sometimes overgeneralize things. And, you know, if they see a black and white dog or a black and white cow, then they may not get that it's a dog and a cow, but black and white, they might overgeneralize and think that um, call it by whatever name they learned it by first. So if they saw the cow first, then the dog might also be a cow just because it's black and white. Does that make sense? And there's other ways that they self-organize incorrectly, but so very quickly. They do a pretty amazing job. So you're also going to want to take note of the stages that's listed on the slide because you'll need those for part of your assignment this week. And these are Piaget's major stages, but he also has sub-stages within these stages. So, like for the first, the sensory motor stage, the sub-stage is just in the sensory motor stage. So, you don't need to know the sub-stages necessarily, but they are very interesting. And so, um, if you have just lots of time, you may want to look those up. And if you don't, then I understand that. So I mentioned that the things Piaget was criticized about was the time periods in the stages. So a good example, I think, is that the main development during that sensory motor stage is the understanding that objects exist and events occur in the world independently of one's own actions. So even if you can't see, it can still exist. So we call that object concept, or object permanence is the more common name that it's known by, although I think your book may use object concept. Object permanence means knowing that an object still exists even if it's hidden. So it requires the ability to form that mental schema, that are representation under a blanket. The child who has achieved this object permanence will know it's there and will actively seek it. And at the beginning, child believes that if they can't see it, if it's hidden, then it's just disappeared, it's gone. In fact, a lot of times we'll tell them it's gone if it's something we don't want them to play with. So the attainment of object permanence usually signals the transition from the sensory motor stage to the pre-operational stage of development. So when they truly have object permanence, then we would believe. And Piaget believed that infants arrived at object permanence at about 8 months old, but later research suggests that this may happen earlier. One of his studies was pretty interesting. One of the reasons that permanence happens earlier than they thought it did was because they have so much better technology today. So Piaget in 1963 wanted to investigate at what age children achieved object permanence. And so he hid that toy under the blanket, and he did it while the child was watching, and then looked to see if the child would search for that object under the blanket where he had hid it. And if they did search for it, some form of object permanence. And Piaget assumed that the child could only search for a hidden toy if he had a mental representation of it. Does that make sense? And so Piaget found that infants search for the hidden toys when they got to be about 8 months of age. And so therefore he decided that that must be when they were able to form that mental representation. So subsequent studies have put forth the idea that there may have been some other reasons why the child didn't search for an object besides the lack of understanding of the situation. So they may recognize that the toy is still there, but there could be some other reasons why they didn't search for it. For interest in the objects, and therefore there would just be no motivation to search for it. Or they may just not have the physical coordination to carry out that search. They may want to search for it and understand that it's hidden, but not have the motor coordination to be able to do that. So that was suggested by a couple of researchers in about 1994, so significantly past the time that Piaget had done his research. And there is some Bauer and Wishart in 1972 did find some evidence that object permanence occurs earlier than Piaget claimed. In fact, they use a lab experiment to study infants between the ages of 1 and 4 months old. So that would be very young children. And instead of using Piaget's blanket technique, they waited for the infant to reach for an object and then saw anymore. And so then they filmed the infant using infrared cameras so that they could still see what was happening. And they found that the infant really did continue to reach for the object for up to 90 seconds after it became invisible. And that doesn't sound like very long, but when you consider that most commercials are 30 seconds, and we know how long those commercials last, That's a significant amount of time, especially for a 1 month old to continue to reach for something. So, again, just like Piaget's study, there's also criticisms of Bauer's study in that each child had up to 3 minutes to complete the task and reach for the object, and within this time period, it's plausible that they may have successfully completed that task just by accident in those 3 minutes. So, um, just babies will randomly reach out, and if they feel something, we know that they'll bring it to their mouth. And so it could just be that that was random reaching out with the shock of the going from light to dark rather than actually looking for the object. So there have been several different variations of that study, and we could talk about them for a couple of hours, but I suspect that you guys probably would prefer that I didn't. Um, so if you do have interest in reading more of those, I have several links that I can send you to if you'll just let. But one of the things that it's important for you to remember, as I mentioned before, is that they actively build their knowledge based on an active participation with the world around them, and also that the adults are responsible for, in many times, most times, in providing learning experiences for those children to explore. Um, so all the theories that we've looked at up until this point emphasize stages, but not all researchers believe that people develop in stages. So where the stage theories might be compared to, like, I don't know, stairs, steps, something like that, um, going up a staircase. And so you have these very clearly defined steps that you would take to get up that staircase. Well, climbing up a mountain where you're fighting for those footholds along the way. And so we're going to come back in our next part and talk briefly, I hope, about some of those theories that are based not on stages or individual steps, but a more uh, continuous development. Not, let me stop this share and I'll be out of this. And I'm sorry that it's taking me so long.